Politicians and the media and most economists are obsessed with government debt, now more so than ever. How many times have we been asked how are we going to pay for the cost of COVID-19? But modern monetary theorists know that governments can create money. Government debt isn't an issue, but maybe there's a way to get people to understand that more government bonds isn't a problem. The easiest way is give people some of those bonds. Then they'll actually see that government debt can be a good thing because it'll mean extra money for them now or for a rainy day. In fact, those bonds could be their retirement plan. People's bonds, a good idea or not? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Now, Steve, we talked last week about the impracticalities of everyone getting a job. It's the idea of a job guarantee run by the public sector sounds like a good idea in principle, but is it actually going to work in practice? And we said probably not. What would we do now, for example, when there are so many people who are going to be unemployed? Would you take an airline pilot and teach them how to do plumbing? And, how many plumbers do we need if that was the case? Instead, there needs to be, and we talked about this last week, some sort of halfway house, which would include some sort of universal payment to keep people alive and to keep them spending when work isn't available. And if we assume that automation is going to become more prevalent, then there are, in the future, we'd assume, lots of people who just won't have jobs, or at least full-time jobs. So that's one issue. Then we have the other problem, that when the government spends more than it taxes, we see that as government debt, and we assume that that's a bad thing because we've been conditioned to think that way. But as we've discussed numerous times on this podcast, a government surplus is in effect taking money out of the economy. It's taking it out of the private sector. A small deficit is a good thing. And right now, of course, a big government deficit is a necessary thing. So why not put those two things together, people's perception of government debt and how we need to shift that, and the need for money to pay for people who don't have much or who don't have jobs. And that's the idea of a people's bond. We know that government debt is issued as government bonds. Usually they're sold on the open market. Sometimes they're bought by the central bank as quantitative easing. Why not have the central bank or the Treasury issue some of those bonds as people's bonds, which we give to everyone? So a proportion of the total debt issued goes to people. So people can then use it as an investment if they're flush with money, or they can sell it if they need cash. Not a bad idea, is it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of thing which the whole spectre that we've created about government debt is because we think about it in terms of our own debt. And of course, if you owe money to a bank, you don't tend to own the bank you owe the money to. I mean, Donald Trump might, or maybe the bank owns him. But for ordinary human beings, when you're in debt to a bank, you're in debt to an independent entity, which will, if you don't pay the bill, will if it's a mortgage, kick you out on the street. It'll pursue you for the money. The government's in a very different situation, because the central bank is an element of the government, and in fact, when it pays dividends, it pays them back to the Treasury. So you effectively have a government being this unique institution, which is its own bank. So its debt is nothing like the debt that you and I owe, that ordinary human beings or firms owe. It's something very, very different, but we still think about it the same way. So this is one potential way we could say, well, it's not that. We're just going to, we can self-finance, and we're going to give you the benefits of the self-financing.
Yeah, a chunk of it. I mean, I'm not saying it's, all government debt suddenly finds itself in the as an asset for people, but as a proportion of it, it would certainly shift thinking, wouldn't it? And then it becomes another instrument, doesn't it? So, and the beauty of it, I think, of course, I'm talking about my idea here, so of course it's beautiful. But the beauty of it is that people are getting money when the government is issuing debt. So obviously it's at a time when times are tough.
Yeah, well, at the moment, times are extremely tough, as we all know.
Yeah.
And
so now would be a great time to introduce it.
They're tough for workers ever since levels of private debt got out of control, because one thing which turned up in my modelling of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, and then had the temerity to turn up in the real world data as well, is that as you have a rising level of private debt, even if it's the firm sector that's borrowing the money, even if the firm sector is borrowing the money just for investment, which is a productive use of debt rather than for speculation, in those cases, it's actually the workers who end up paying for the high level of debt. They have a fall in their income share over time. I can talk about that if we need to elaborate, but that's just one of the outcomes of my modelling of Minsky, which turns up in the real world. Workers have been getting less and less and bankers more and more, and it's all been driven by the increase in private debt. So what about if we potentially use that the government's money creation and the government's creation of bonds to cover that money creation? What if we use that as a way of putting money in the hands of workers who are currently suffering from the directions of a fundamentally private credit-based monetary system?
So it would require the creation of money. I'm just wondering, how is money created normally when you have high levels of government debt and you issue those bonds? Because those bonds are bought, if they're sold on the open market, it's just someone with money buying that debt. It's not creating new money, is it? It's just transferring that government debt to the private sector. So the private sector's got the asset of the bonds now, and how is that creating extra money?
It's not, and that's the point that Stephanie Kelton makes very well on the deficit myth. And like you remember, you and I have had conversations quite a few times over the years, and you've asked me, does a government deficit create money? And I'd normally, I hadn't worked it out. Okay, my hedging answer was that to the extent the central bank buys the bonds, then it creates money. Now, when I did did you see my classic palindrome, Omomo?
Yes. You've done a few palindromes now.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, so long as you're amused by them.
That's a palindrome: left, right, left, and inside out, which is rather cute. But in doing that, I had to finally model the government money creation process in Minsky, which, of course, I designed Minsky so that we could actually use double entry bookkeeping to model the dynamics of financial flows. And one claim that Stephanie Kelton made in the deficit myth, most of the deficit myth was, very familiar to me because I've been a part of the non-orthodox crew on money for a long, long time. So
it's a great read, though.
Yeah, it's a good read. It's a very easy read. It puts
exactly.
It puts a heresy across well, doesn't it?
It does. And if I love one bit out of it, sorry, I'm interrupting you in mid-flow, but one bit I liked of it when she asked US senators if they could do away with, or they should do away with government debt. And of course, they all agreed that was really important. Then she asked if they should also do away with government bonds, which would be the outcome of doing away with debt. And they were all left very confused. So it did demonstrate that most people in government haven't got a clue how things work.
Yeah, and I'll give them an out here. It's not easy. You have to think in double entry bookkeeping terms, and you have to see the impact of one change on another change somewhere else. So, and most mainstream economists get it wrong, and this is why we have all this confusion right now. If the mainstream actually understood money, we wouldn't have these conversations in the first place, because it would be just mainstream talking about money is like astronomers in the 1500s talking about sunrise, and actually meaning that they thought the sun was on a huge circle surrounding the Earth, and it was rotating past us. We were in the center of the universe. That's the level of understanding the mainstream has about it.
Do you mean that's not what's happening? So I must go back to school. So
you better go back to school.
But so if the money's not being created, but we are passing some of it over to the workers, if you like, I hate using that expression.
Yeah.
But doesn't that mean that that we are in effect rebalancing the economy a little bit? So the money that would have gone to the finance sector is now finding itself in public hands.
And that's why I like the idea, because if you, again, looking at the whole issue of how money is created, the essential feature in a general sense that's necessary for money to be created is the transaction you're talking about must operate on the asset side of the banking sector and also the liabilities and equity side.
So do you want to know how that might work in practice? Then listen to the full version of this podcast. To do that, you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, or you can subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. You'll get access to this and 220 or so other editions of the Debunking Economics podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Back again next week. Thanks for listening.